Today's talk is titled The U.S. South Atlantic Ecosystem Status Report, Development and Emerging Applications. Our speaker today is Dr. Kevin Craig, who is the branch chief of the Atlantic, let me get this right, Atlantic and Caribbean Reef Fish of the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. He can correct me on that in a moment. But Dr. Craig's research interests focus on environmental effects on fish population and community dynamics in the Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic regions. Prior to his current position, he led stock assessments for several South Atlantic species. He earned an undergraduate degree from North Carolina State University and a master's in fisheries from the University of Washington, and his PhD in ecology from Duke University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Craig.
Thank you, Katie. I still get that acronym wrong myself sometimes. So thanks for the introduction, and thanks to you and to Peg Brady for the opportunity to participate in this seminar series. Thoughts out to folks in Florida as Nicole comes ashore in the next day or so. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here. I think I'm going to turn off my camera and then I'll turn it back on after I'm finished. So you don't have to look at me looking at a screen. Okay. So as Katie mentioned, I'm going to talk about the South Atlantic Ecosystem Status Report. This is the first status report for this region. So I think along with the Caribbean, which is in progress, and the Gulf of Mexico, which was completed several years ago, will now within the next year have ESRs for all of the regions under the purview of the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Todd Kellison and Mandy Karnauskas provided a lot of support throughout this effort. Samantha Binion-Rock is a postdoctoral associate with me who took time out to develop a number of indicators and really help to push the report across the finish line. Sean Reagan, who is with NOS, was also instrumental. He really spearheaded this effort to get some of the social science indicators into the report. So if you've been involved in the development of an ESR or seen an ESR, you know they're a pretty heavy lift. They require a lot of collaboration. I hope I got everybody listed here, but we had input from at least 67 individuals from 23 different organizations. There are 26 co-authors on the report. Most of the federal agencies that have a presence in the region, National Marine Fisheries Service, AOML, USGS were represented. We had folks from all of the state agencies contribute, as well as a number of the universities. So there was a lot of effort put into this, and I appreciate all of the contributions of the various people listed here. The report is currently published as a tech memo, so it's available at these links below. It's in the NOAA library repository. It's also available on the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment website, and we did have a web story that came out early last year that Keely Belva and Ellen Spooner were really instrumental in helping to put together, and I think that's still available online as well. So what I'm going to try to do today is four things: give you an overview of the South Atlantic ESR. I'll describe a number of the indicators that are included and some of the emergent patterns that have come out of those indicators. And then I'll give a brief sort of thumbnail sketch of three projects or three areas where the ESR is beginning to have an impact, and those are related to reef fish recruitment declines in the South Atlantic, shifting species distributions, as well as some efforts to move towards a more adaptive management framework for dolphin fish or mahi-mahi. And then I'll provide some summary and some next steps. So the U.S. South Atlantic is my mind, very much a transitional ecosystem. It's bounded by the Florida Reef Tract in the south, which extends from the Dry Tortugas up to Point St. Lucie over about 350 miles. Albemarle-Pamlico Sound is at the northern end, the largest lagoonal estuary along the Atlantic seaboard, the second largest estuary in the United States. So it's very much tropical in the south, temperate in the north. You can see at the upper right the management boundaries here in red that delineates the jurisdiction of the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. The physics offshore are very much dominated by the Gulf Stream. And this region from basically Cape Hatteras to Cape Canaveral is known as the South Atlantic Bight. Its offshore areas are mostly characterized by a shallow sloping shelf tends to over 100 nautical miles. It's mostly sand bottom, but it's interspersed with these hard bottom areas composed of coral, rock, and other rubble. And those areas are particularly important for a number of the managed species in the region because they harbor high densities and high diversity of a number of reef fish species. So the report is organized into various categories. Large-scale climate drivers, things like the AMO, North Atlantic Tripole, NAO, which impact the region. Physical and chemical pressures, sea surface temperature, acidification, sea level rise, things like that. We include information on habitat state, lower trophic levels, upper trophic levels, a number of ecosystem services, and then human dimensions. So overall, the report has 46 indicators in it, 143 different time series. It's about 100 pages in length. You don't have to read the entire report. There is a highlights section at the beginning that describes a number of the general trends with a focus on the most recent conditions. And then this shows the table of contents for the report where we can get the details. And as I mentioned, this is available in the NOAA repository. We also include a synthesis section at the end where we apply a number of multivariate techniques to try to synthesize across the different indicators, as well as a number of research recommendations that arose over the course of developing the report. So I wanted to show you some of the indicators, starting with some of the human dimensions. The 4 states along the South Atlantic are among the top 12 in the nation in terms of population growth. That was outside of Florida. That was a little bit of a surprise to me, but it is a very rapidly growing region. These are maps of population density going back to the early 1800s. So up through the 1800s and 1900s, the area was mostly a plantation-based agricultural economy. And that really started to change in the 1950s. There was economic expansion and diversification, particularly around port cities like Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, and Miami. And 2 things really facilitated migration and population growth in the region. Congress passed the Central and South Florida Project, which is a congressional act that drained lots of swampland and marshland, led to development of road infrastructure and water control structures. And then home air conditioning was another important occurrence. HVAC systems were invented in the 1930s. They really started to gain prominence in the late 40s and 50s, and then by 1960s, nearly all homes that were being built were built with central AC, and that led to a population boom, particularly off of Florida, and you can see that here in the 1950s. That's continued through to the 2000s, and that's been characterized by very high population densities along the east coast of Florida, but also growing populations in South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina, large retiree population in Florida, and also increasing economic ties to Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean. This kind of gives you the landscape of how the demographics have changed in the region over the last 200 years. The other thing that came out of the report is it's very evident that the South Atlantic has a expanding recreationally based coastal economy. This left panel shows developed areas in 2010, so these high density areas along the coast, particularly in South Florida, the Orlando metro area, and also smaller cities up along the coast. Combined with the high population density and indications of a strengthening economy, that's led to a really increase in sort of recreational activity. These two panels on the right show employment in the ocean economy as well as ocean-related GDP. That employment is 85% within the tourism and recreation sector. I think the next largest sector is marine transport, which is like 10 or 11%. And you can see the dip in 2008 associated with the recession, and then this kind of monotonic increase in employment, the ocean sector, and ocean-related GDP since then. So increasing access to the coast, increasing human population, strong economy, it's led to a lot of recreational activity, and that's very much reflected in the nature of the fisheries. So we've seen a shift in the Southeast from a coastal maritime economy that had a large or vibrant commercial fishing sector to more of a tourist and leisure-based economy with a growing recreational sector. These top two panels show commercial landings on the left and inflation-adjusted commercial revenues on the right for the commercial fisheries in the region. And those peaked in the 1970s and 1980s, and they've been declining pretty consistently since then. At the same time, recreational effort on the left and total recreational landings in the middle have been increasing since the 2000s. And I put this picture here to remind me that this recreational effort, we use number of angler trips, but the other component that we don't have good quantitative information on is recreational fishing power. I mean, there's been an increase in capacity in the recreational sector to get further offshore, access places that previously couldn't be accessed, and so on. The other interesting pattern that emerged from the report was described in this paper that Cal Schertzer led a few years ago. If you look at the species that are managed by the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council, which is mostly snapper grouper species, the proportion of landings of those managed species that are coming from the recreational sector has increased over time. If you look back in the 80s and 90s, there was always a strong recreational component that where recreational landings accounted for somewhere between 65 and 75% of the total. That increased in the 2000s, and in the most recent years has approached upwards of 80% of the managed species, federally managed species, are coming from the recreational sector. So pretty strong shifts from a coastal maritime economy to more of a recreationally based tourist leisure economy. So that gives you a little bit about the socioeconomics and the demographics. I want to shift to look at some of the environmental conditions. We do document a number of what I'm going to call chronic ecosystem stressors in the report. These are things that change fairly gradually over long periods of time. Their link to managed resources is often indirect, or it occurs via some cumulative effects or perhaps interactive effects with other stressors. And as a result of that, they're very subject to this phenomenon of shifting baselines, where we can fail to perceive changes in the system because those changes are occurring slowly, and we're only observing them over the most recent time period. So these are things like sea level rise. So this is data from a number of coastal gauges up and down the coast that show the mean local relative sea level has been increasing pretty consistently since the 1920s, when measurements first began. We also have indications that the South Atlantic is beginning to acidify. This is data from Gray's Reef National Marine Sanctuary that maintains an offshore buoy. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing pretty consistently based on those buoy measurements since the early 2000s. It's not as evident in the seawater measurements because the CO2 concentration is not only a function of the overlying air, but it's impacted by processes occurring across the land-sea interface. But what you do see is the highest concentrations of CO2 in the time series are occurring mostly within the last 5 years or so. So above average CO2 concentration since about 2015. And there's a nice paper by Janet Reimer that kind of describes this phenomena and links it to ship of opportunity measurements throughout the region to look at how acidification varies throughout the South Atlantic region. Nutrient loading, this is another indicator that we track in the report. We generated this mostly through collaborations with USGS. We don't have good annual measurements, but we do have information from the water quality assessment reports that USGS conducts for the region. They measure total nitrogen, total phosphorus for 8 different watersheds in the South Atlantic. And if you look across those different watersheds, 6 of the 8 are showing increases in total nitrogen, and 7 of the 8 are showing increases in total phosphorus across this 10-year period. And the magnitude of those increases are on the order of 20% or so. So we did spend a fair amount of time on generating indicators of temperature change. And so I'm going to show you multiple indicators of changes in temperature over different temporal scales. And this is the first one. This is mean decadal temperature since the 1960s. This is based on ocean temperature data that's in the NCEI World Ocean Database. It's all in situ measurements in the region going back to the 1950s. And what we see is about a 0.5 degree C decline in mean decadal temperature from the 60s to the 1980s, both at the surface and maybe perhaps a little bit steeper at the bottom. But then since then, pretty consistent increase in temperature from the 1980s to the 2010s, and that increase is on the order of about 1 degree C in the mean decadal temperature. So long-term temperatures increasing to some extent, at least since the 1980s. We also have temperature data from a number of the fishery independent surveys in the region. So this is based on trap video survey that's conducted along the South Atlantic, these green dots, as well as bottom trawl data that's collected closer to shore. This is standardized. The methods are described in this paper by Nate Batchelor. And you see a lot of variability in the mean temperature over the early spring to early fall period. This is a well-documented coastal upwelling event that occurred in 2003, where temperatures on the shelf were very cool. But you notice in about 2014, we start to see this increase in temperature. And this period from 2014 to 2019 or so is the warmest series of years on record since the early 1990s. And this will come up in a number of the other temperature indicators, as well as a number of the other ocean indicators, that it looks like some sort of changes have occurred in the last 5 to 10 years, mostly since 2013 or 2014. And this is sea surface temperature, so a similar pattern here. After 2013, sea surface temperatures increased. That's evident in 2 different satellite products at 2 different spatial resolutions. It's most evident in the winter temperatures, so certainly warmer winters since 2013. We're not really seeing these cool winters that were more common in the 2000s, 1990s, and even going back to the 1980s. More moderate increases, but nonetheless increases in summer temperature as well. So this is consistent with the shipboard survey measurements that are indicating increases in temperature since the mid 2010s or so. Those changes in sea surface temperature are associated with a number of other changes and may be contributing causes to a number of other changes in physical conditions offshore. So this is the same temperature time series I showed previously. We've also seen a decrease in upwelling intensity over that same time frame. And also some changes in the Gulf Stream. So the Gulf Stream has been in more of a onshore position in the more recent years compared to where it had been since the 90s and particularly the early 2000s. So these may be linked to some degree. Increasing sea surface temperatures could lead to increasing stratification, which could actually impede upwelling. And then that can be modulated by Gulf Stream position. So typically when the Gulf Stream is a little closer to shore, there's a little less upwelling at the shelf slope break. And so these changes in physical conditions are occurring over about the same time frame and potentially influencing nutrient dynamics and processes at the base of the food web. We don't have a good handle on how those are operating. This is a chlorophyll time series based on MODIS satellite imagery. And you do see a lot of variability in chlorophyll, sort of low periods of chlorophyll A and from 2010 to 2015, and then increasing chlorophyll in the most recent years since 2015. But it seems like there's some changes going on in the open ocean conditions over these recent years, the last 5 to 7 years. And I'll come back to that later in the context of the potential declines in recruitment. We've also seen a number of changes in the offshore reef fish community. This is an extension of some data that was published in this paper by Batchelor and Smart. What's interesting about this is it shows a targeted reef fish abundance. So these are these are species that are typically targeted by fisheries. A lot of variability in catch rates as well as in the species richness, but declines in abundance again in the mid to late 2000s, both in total or in abundance and species richness. But more surprisingly, this is also occurring in fishes that aren't typically targeted by fisheries. So these have declined at a similar rate, or in some cases more severely than is evident in the targeted species. So this is suggesting there may be something going on in terms of the reef fish community that might be related to things other than directed fishing. It doesn't mean that fishing is not involved. It could be that a lot of these species are still caught as bycatch of those fisheries, but the suggestion is there's something going on here besides just directed fisheries that are altering the composition and the abundance of the reef fish on these hard bottom offshore structures. And we see evidence of that in video indices from those same surveys. So this is showing standardized indices of abundance for black sea bass, gag, scamp, red porgy. These are all been declining pretty severely from the 2000s to the to the 2010s, but it's not across the board. There's been increases in other species, particularly snappers, things like red snapper and vermilion snapper. So I wanted to synthesize a little bit across these different indicators. This is something we tried to do in the report. We applied a bunch of multivariate approaches to try to integrate across the indicators, the individual indicators. And there's a couple of interesting patterns that come out. This is a principal component analysis for the physical and chemical pressures. So this is over a 28-year time period from 1990 to 2017. PC1 is characterized mostly by estuarine or nearshore indicators. These are things like stream flow, regional precipitation, coastal salinity to some extent. And then PC2 is characterized mostly by these oceanic indicators that I described before: shelf temperature, Gulf Stream position, upwelling. And what you start to see here is the most recent years across all integrated across the indicators are showing up in the upper left quadrant. So we're seeing more extreme conditions across a number of physical and chemical pressures in the last 5 to 7 years than we've seen over the previous 20 to 30 years. And we see that same kind of pattern in the upper trophic levels. So this is indicators that were developed primarily from the fishery independent surveys. In this case, the first principal component was characterized mostly by indicators from the South Atlantic Trap Video Survey that characterized the abundance and species richness of offshore reef fish. PC2 is more of a general sort of fish indicator that's characterized by benthic or demersal species closer to shore, offshore reef fish, as well as some indicators of coral reef fish abundance and diversity in South Florida and mean trophic level. And what you see is these more recent years, conditions within the upper trophic level community are more extreme on both of these axes than has been observed since the 1990s. So again, suggesting of some recent changes in the fish communities. This does translate to a number of the ecosystem services indicators as well. So these are things like harvestable biomass from the stock assessments, commercial landings and revenue. PC2 here is more of reflective of species of concern, sea turtles, marine birds, and to some extent recreational landings or effort. And you see the same kind of pattern, that the most recent years are showing the most extreme values, particularly along this fisheries axis. And so this was a surprise to us. It does suggest that there's similar changes going on in different components of the ecosystem. This was our first cut at this, so it doesn't necessarily mean that these things are causally related to each other. We would need quite a bit more work to decipher what's driving some of these underlying patterns. But what it does suggest is that over the most recent 5 or 10 years, multiple components of the ecosystem are in a state that we really haven't observed over the previous 3 decades. So that does suggest that there are changes occurring, and those changes are more extreme in the more recent years compared to what's been observed historically. So I wanted to shift gears here a minute and talk about 3 kind of what I'll call emerging applications in the South Atlantic. So these are projects or issues that are definitely works in progress. Most of them have started over the last 1 to 2 years. So I don't have definitive results to show you, but I did want to give you a thumbnail sketch of these issues and then show you how the ecosystem status report is actually making some contribution to these issues. So the first one is, I mentioned previously is the recruitment declines in South Atlantic reef fishes. So this is a issue of growing concern. Snapper grouper complex consists of about 55 species. It's the largest F&P within the South Atlantic Council's jurisdiction. It supports multiple recreational and commercial fisheries. And management of reef fishes has historically been based on single species stock assessments that, for the most part, have assumed some stationarity in the stock recruitment relationship. And what we've seen recently is declines in recruitment in a number of species. This is these are recruitment deviations from the individual assessments for a number of species: black sea bass, gag grouper, red grouper, snowy grouper, red porgy. And what you see is a lot of variability year to year, but beginning in about 2013, 2014, a number of these species show pretty strong indications of declines in recruitment that are occurring despite some pretty restrictive fishing regulations. That's not occurring across the board. There are a number of species that are showing positive or at least stable trends in recruitment. This is red snapper, this top line, which has shown the opposite pattern, pretty significant increases in recruitment over the last 10 years. A number of other species, both snapper species and some coastal pelagics like cobia, have shown fairly stable recruitment. And if you apply the same approach I showed earlier with the principal component analysis, what you see is that these recruitment patterns are separating out the most recent years, 2013 through 2017, as being different from the pattern over the previous 20 to 25 years. And that's evident both in this PCA plot here, as well as in chronological clustering analysis, where the major break in the recruitment pattern is occurring between 2012 and 2013. So a very different recruitment pattern in the late 2010s compared to the previous 20 years or so. So where does the ESR come in? Well, we have a number of hypotheses we're evaluating listed here. So recruitment overfishing is one possibility. It may be a contributing factor, but work we've done so far suggests it would at best be a partial explanation. We've also looked some at the potential for predation on early life stages. Sperm limitation associated with protogeny is another potential explanation. These species do switch from female to male, so increased fishing pressure may lead to decreases in abundance of males and potentially sperm limitation. That is a real possibility. A number of the species that show the recruitment declines also have this protogynous life history. And then the final hypothesis is that these changes in winter ocean conditions, in particular, the increase in sea surface temperature, changes in upwelling dynamics, the position of the Gulf Stream, may be impacting the base of the food web during the spawning period and leading to some change in productivity or a mismatch in productivity with spawning time. And that's potentially a contributing factor to these species that are showing low recruitment. So this is a work in progress, but it is probably our leading candidate hypothesis at this point is that these changes in ocean conditions are contributing to these declines in recruitment. So the second example has to do with changing species distributions. So this is a concern across management jurisdictions as species shift or expand into new areas. It's also been a concern within the South Atlantic region itself. A lot of the recreationally harvested coastal pelagics migrate up and down the coast, and there's been concerns about the timing of availability or variation in fishing pressure or increases in fishing pressure downstream influencing abundance in the northern regions, those sorts of things. So we have very limited information on spatial distributions for most South Atlantic species, and we don't have information on that in the ecosystem status report. So this is something that we're very much interested in tracking, and it's a data gap in the report as it stands now. So to help address this, we've been working with Jay Cow, who's at NC State, and he's been leading an effort to develop a joint species distribution model for South Atlantic reef fish. This is based on fishery independent video data for 21 species listed here. This data is available since 2011. And some of the preliminary results, we are seeing some indications in the model that black sea bass and perhaps some of the other species are showing some indications of northeastward shifts over time. So expansion both into, or shifts both into more northern waters, but also to deeper waters. Where does the ESR come in? Well, the current model is based only on the spatial and temporal correlation and the catch rates. It doesn't include any sort of environmental covariates. So we're looking into the possibility that some of these changes in distribution are driven by some of the environmental factors that I mentioned previously. There's also interest of integrating some of the distribution mapping efforts in the Mid-Atlantic and New England with what's happening in the South Atlantic. And so that's there's a number of discussions and proposals to try to connect distribution models for South Atlantic species with those for Mid-Atlantic and New England species. And black sea bass is one of the candidate species that occurs along the entire Atlantic seaboard and has shown some indications of northward shifts in the Mid-Atlantic and New England regions. We also have the potential to add this as an indicator to the ecosystem status report. So I don't expect you to read this, but this is indicators of the center of gravity for all 21 of those species, both in the north-south and the east-west direction. And so this is something that we're particularly interested in being able to track over time as species distributions change. So the last example is something that I've been tangentially involved in. This is work that's being led primarily by Julia Bird and John Hadley at the South Atlantic Council, as well as Matt McPherson and Mandy Karnauskas. And the intent here is to develop more of an adaptive management framework for mahi-mahi or dolphin fish that can be used by the council to more effectively link management procedures with the stakeholders' objectives for the fishery. So this is a approach that has been used in other contexts. Is very much a participatory modeling type approach where workshops are held with a number of the fishermen to try to gain a better understanding of the fishery, identify what it is the stakeholders value and what their concerns are, develop some hypotheses for why the system may be changing or how it's changing. And with respect to mahi, there's a number of concerns. The abundance of mahi is markedly decreased and the sizes have decreased, particularly in South Florida. And that's been mostly a recent phenomenon over the last 5 years or so. Some of the interactions with fishermen suggest that there's been changes in the environment, and those changes may be affecting the spatial variability and the localized availability of fish in different regions up and down the coast. Mahi are tricky because they are an international species, so they do migrate through international waters, and they're subject to both fisheries and environmental conditions well outside of the purview of the South Atlantic. But they are managed by the South Atlantic Council, not only in the South Atlantic proper, but up and down the Atlantic seaboard. So it's a tricky management issue to get a handle on. Some of the participatory workshops have indicated that fishermen have indicated a number of things consistent with the ecosystem status report: warming waters, changes in timing of fish availability, low forage abundance, and also just general changes in water conditions. So this has led to a couple of hypotheses that have been informed by the ecosystem status report. One is that some of these changes in ocean conditions are altering the local availability of dolphins, potentially through altered migration, also potential impacts on growth. Dolphins have very specific temperature preferences. They're also the species with the highest potential for distribution shifts based on the climate vulnerability analysis for the South Atlantic. And so this shows temperature distributions of dolphin fish for different regions, and they're mostly around 28 to 29 degrees C. You rarely see them above 30 degrees C. And this upper right is a downscaled version of that satellite imagery I showed you earlier for the South Florida region that shows warming temperatures, particularly after 2013, 2014. And in many cases, the summer temperatures in particular during July, August, and into September are approaching that 30-degree threshold where you tend not to see mahi. So it could be that changes in ocean conditions are altering local availability off Florida. One of the other hypotheses is that this is a function of expansions of the recreational fishery that are leading to localized depletion. So as I showed earlier, there's a lot of high intensity development along the coast, particularly in South Florida, and increases in access with increases in human populations and increases in recreational fishing effort may be one of the underlying causes of localized depletion of mahi. So just to try to step back and summarize a little bit, so the South Atlantic is a rapidly developing region. It's characterized by expanding recreational fisheries that have increasing fishing capacity. It is experiencing a number of ecosystem stressors. Some of these are internal to the South Atlantic, like changes in nutrient inputs. Some of them are driven by larger processes external to the South Atlantic. Then the implications of those for the managed resources are largely unknown at this point. What we have seen is that over the last 3 decades, some of the largest changes in multiple ecosystem indicators have occurred in the most recent years. And so that suggests that we're seeing conditions now that don't really have any precedent over the last 3 decades. And some of these changes, and particularly in ocean conditions, could be affecting fishery resources at multiple scales. So the South Florida example definitely has a local aspect to it, where there's decreases in availability off Florida, but those aren't necessarily manifest in other regions in the South Atlantic. The reef fish recruitment declines, I think, are more of a regional scale issue applicable to the entire South Atlantic. And then the species distribution shifts example has relevance to up and down the coastline, and in terms of how councils and management bodies deal with species that are expanding or shifting across jurisdictional boundaries. So I think the ESR is a new tool, but an important tool that's helping to provide some context for these issues, develop some hypotheses, and provide information that can help address some of these management issues. So some of the next steps, as I mentioned, this was the first iteration of the ESR. For that reason, we were pretty kind of comprehensive in terms of the things that we included. I think future iterations were looking to develop fewer but more targeted indicators, perhaps transitioning to things like state of the ecosystem reports, which are routinely developed for other regions, and also trying to move more towards automation of some of these indicators. Other things that we're working towards is improving stakeholder engagement. We have done a number of briefing presentations to the advisory panel, the South Atlantic Council, the SSC, CCART, and other regional management bodies. We do have a presentation at the December council meeting. This will be the first one since the report has been finalized. And then the last thing is, improving cross-region collaboration. So at this point, we have ecosystem status reports for the South Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic, and the New England region. So they cover the entire Atlantic seaboard. And we began comparing across regions at a workshop that we had last August to try to coordinate science activities better across the different regions. And we did find that there was an overlap with the South Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic, both in terms of a number of the indicators that we're tracking, as well as some of the things where we have data limitations, like the benthic conditions, forage species, and habitat. So I think there's a opportunity here to sort of combine forces and look at how ecosystems may be changing up and down the entire Atlantic seaboard. So I'll stop there. We are looking for feedback. If you have feedback on the report, please contact myself or Todd Kellison or Mandy Karnauskas, and I would be glad to entertain any questions. Thank you.